I'll spend the first 20 minutes or so kind of providing what I believe are some of the things that a group like this, a regional organization like this in California, might want to be considering, and then we're going to have a little bit of dialogue, go back and forth, where he can kind of drill a lot of what I mentioned and suggest into some practical takeaways for you all to understand. In thinking about what I wanted to visit on today, clearly there's a book that we'll be talking about called The Latino Century. It's about the largest ethnic demographic change in this country's history. After 250 years, this country, within our lifetimes, within about 10 to 12 years, will become a non-white majority country for the first time in our nation's history. And that doesn't happen easily in any society. There's never been a recorded historical event of such profound significance without conflict, without war, without social upheaval, without a whole host of social issues and challenges, particularly as it relates to the identity of a nation and a people. And a lot of what we're dealing with and experiencing at this moment is related to that. But I also want to take a bigger step back because as somebody who's watching politics through a demographic and social lens, I want to point out a couple of other key issues, these sort of big tectonic plate issues that are changing the country and California that might hopefully provide a little bit of insight as to why a lot of the people in the country, our politicians specifically, are behaving the way that they are. And I believe we are on the cusp of a very significant generational moment that is going to redefine California politics. And that redefinition, I think, is going to be very important for a group like yours as it looks towards economic development, as it looks towards building a middle class, as it looks towards aspirational policy solutions to address the challenges of the next 15, 20, 30 years and beyond. And I want to start this story, for some of you in the room may remember this era, this time frame, 1992 to 1994. Almost 30 years ago, began this latest California chapter, which led to essentially a one-party state in California. I want to talk about why that happened, because I believe the demographic trends are leading to an end of that. Now, when I say that, that doesn't mean I believe that there's going to be a Republican resurgence. I believe that both parties are going to be foundationally transformed into something very different than we've experienced before also. And I believe California, in many ways, even though we were a lagging indicator in this change, I'll talk about that in just a second, is going to go through much more upheaval as we go through this process, much more significant transformation, because our very conceptions of things like race and identity, class, economic class, and partisanship are changing. They're already deeply into changing. Who would have thought, who could have imagined just a handful of years ago that the Republican Party would be levying the largest tax increase in modern American history right now? We call them tariffs or taxes. Would be pro-Russia in our global perspective, and be protectionist, working against free markets. That's none of that is determinative or descriptive of the Republican Party that we have known since the end of the Second World War. The Democratic Party, to its own measure, is also foundationally different. Okay, and we'll get into some of those changes, but the tension in the Democratic Party, I think, is really, really fascinating because I believe in many ways the Democratic Party is going to change much more than the Republican Party because of the nature of its coalitions. The coalitions are fraying, they're frayed. One of the reasons why the Democratic Party at this moment in time is having such a difficult time figuring out who it is as the party out of power, as a party that lost, is because the coalitions that it believed constituted its forever dominant majority. Remember the Obama coalition? We used to talk about the Obama coalition. We talked about this kind of forever new era that we were in. The very premise of that has collapsed. And understanding why is going to help us understand why California is on the cusp of, again, some very significant changes. So between 1992 and 1994, something very significant happens. The most significant was the end of the Cold War. Anybody remember Fort Ord? What year was that decommissioned as a military base? 1994. Probably that was certain. So that was probably somebody who would know what BRAC was, right? The base realignment and closure process that just hit California so hard foundationally changed the economy of the state. Now I think Fort Ord is like, you're doing like science and technology research, and it's Cal State Monterey Bay, right? Like, you guys, people in this room were probably part of the decision making and the leadership of making the transformation from that last generation to this generation that defined where that was going to go. It's that same wisdom and experience you're going to need to incorporate as the country and our state goes through this next generational change. Okay? So the end of the Cold War does something very significant to California. It reorients our economy entirely, and we begin to see the exodus of the blue-collar, working-class manufacturing base that was primarily located in the Los Angeles basin. So much of this whole Beach Boys persona, this mythology of what America and the California economy was the idea that you could pack up your Volkswagen Beetle in the 60s or 70s from Oklahoma City or Cleveland, Ohio, or Memphis, Tennessee, drive out west after high school graduation, get a job at Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon, McDonnell Douglas, a whole handful of the post World War II economy, the Cold War, benefited in large part, by the way, by a former governor of California, Ronald Reagan's largesse in military spending. You can get a job, work on a manufacturing line, even get into middle management, buy a house in a suburb in Los Angeles, have a couple of kids, a picket fence, go on vacations. That is so far outside of the understanding of anybody coming into California right now without a college degree to be able to make a lifestyle like that work. That is a relic of the past. In fact, we are seeing a pretty considerable exodus from a lot of these regions. And the reason the people that are leaving, despite conventional wisdom, aren't necessarily exclusive to the very wealthy. They're working class people where affordability is being pushed out. So this is the most significant demographic change that transformed California. The exodus of the blue-collar, white, working-class voter. By the way, they were Republicans. We were exporting Republicans. They moved to Texas. They moved to Arizona. They moved to Nevada. They moved to Colorado. And guess what happened? A lot of those states started to turn very ruby red. At the same time, we were becoming more blue for two other reasons. The second reason is the book that I wrote, The Rise of the Latino Voter, the change of the Latino electorate. What we saw was a change from that blue-collar, working-class manufacturing economy to a service economy, service work. And Latinos, a wide swath of undocumented, but far, far more legal migrants were coming into particularly Southern California, but of course, state and nationwide, working in the economy that we were creating, which was largely a service sector economy. And I say that because while there was a lot of foresight in some regions, this being one of them, with what you did with Fort Ord, the long-term economic plan from the state of California on what we were going to do in the post-World War II economy never materialized. I believe it was because the BRAC impact was so significant, it took policymakers aside, it just left them breathless. It was so sweeping. California got hit far harder than anybody else. If you remember the recession, the early recession of the 1990s, you will remember and probably feel a lot of the same economic stress, concerns, and anxiety that you feel today, even greater at that point in time. What does this all mean? We have always relied on the spending, the federal spending of Fort Ord. We have always relied on the federal spending of the military-industrial complex, not just here, but throughout California, to be the basis of the economy after the end of the Second World War. We couldn't rely on that anymore. In many ways, we are seeing this global order led by American idealism collapsing. The same American ideal we built globally at the same time that we started defense spending collapse. That collapse that is happening now is no less, but I would argue not much more significant than the collapse that we were seeing at the end of the Cold War era. I take some hope in that. So again, two things to take us back. The collapse of the blue-collar manufacturing base, the rise of the Latino vote. California is on track to become a non-white majority state within 10, 20, 30-year period. It ends up happening about 2010. We are now, I think everybody knows this, but we are now a minority majority state, as we call it. Latinos are the largest ethnic plurality in California, and a whole host of states begin the process of following along with us. The third thing that happens is the rise of this little fad in Silicon Valley known as the internet. This thing that dramatically changed the way not only commerce was done and business was done, and the culture, by the way, of the business community was forever changed, but it begins to change our very society, our social mores, and the way high-tech voters start to engage with their communities and politically. All three of these dynamics are tectonic in their impact in California's culture. Any one of them would have had a significant impact, an overwhelming impact in the political structure, especially the damage being done to the Republican Party. But all three happened at the same time. And you see a 30-year period where Republicans and their failure to adjust begin to shrink to what we call a super minority status. The party that gave us Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, now becomes a super minority party with virtually no relevance in the statewide political process for an entire generation. And it's easy when you're living in these moments to think that this is the way it's always going to be. Okay? What I'm here to tell you is that era, I believe, there's a lot of evidence to suggest, is over. In 2022 and 2024, exactly 30 years to the date, to the moment, we started to see something that we have not seen. I, as a student of Latino politics, had never seen since the early 1990s, which was a rightward shift of Latino voters. They were leaving the Democratic Party and voting more and more Republican. Perhaps coincidentally, perhaps not, they were voting for this guy named Donald Trump. And the question I would get most often asked is, how is that possible? How is this possible? And while it was very hard to come up with an answer for that in 2016 and 2020, it's pretty easy, at least from my estimation, now. And that is what we're witnessing is not just a racial transformation, not just a change in the way we view minority voters, not just in the way that Latino voters who are changing themselves are looking at the world and seeing the world. We are witnessing a transformation of our class politics, where we are seeing this income inequality gap that you've heard talked about for many, many decades now, most acute here in California with a direct racial correlation. We call it a wealth disparity, we call it an income inequality gap, but let's be really candid on what it is. It's also a racial gap. The people at the bottom of the big and growing poor pyramid are Latino. The shrinking smaller tip of the point, overwhelmingly older, white, college-educated, and homeowners. Incidentally, most of those voters live in the eight-county area surrounding the Bay Area, who do one thing. They do a lot of things differently than everybody else in California, a lot. But one of the things is they vote in very, very, very high numbers. So you start to see the rise of representatives in our political structure from that part of the state. Dianne Feinstein in 1992 was elected from San Francisco. Barbara Boxer was elected in 1992 from Marin. Nancy Pelosi begins her ascent to power and ultimately becomes the speaker in a large part of that 30-year swath. John Burton, probably the most definitive Senate leader here in the state Senate of his generation, commands a large part of that time. For Jerry Brown, mayor of Oakland, and from an old San Francisco family, comes in and becomes governor again as well. And on and on and on. Most of the policies that we have advanced that most people would consider landmark or most definitive of this era came from legislators, or at least the power base within that 8-county area. Today, our senators are Latino from Los Angeles, and Adam Schiff from Los Angeles, Southern Californians. We are seeing this increasing rightward shift amongst working class Latino voters who are demonstrating a whole lot of proclivities that look a lot like populism, moving away from the current power structure. Incidentally, there's not a lot of evidence suggesting that Latinos are becoming more conservative. There's very, very, very little evidence. There's a lot of evidence showing that we are becoming much more populist, that the rightward shift is emblematic of really a rejection of the current state of affairs as it is a compelling vote or proactive support for both Donald Trump or the Republican Party. Okay? And you're starting to see, you even saw Kevin McCarthy, who was, the Speaker of the House for one shining moment, I think a brief couple of moments from Bakersfield, right? You start to see a changing, a rattling of the power structure that defined California politics to the point where even tech workers, the Silicon Valley shift is happening to the right as well. It's not just the tech bros like Elon Musk and the Peter Thiels and the Reid Hoffmans. It's the working class, that it's not, I wouldn't even call it upper middle class. It's that lower upper class, like, people making just $30 million a year, not $1 billion a year, right? Those folks are kind of going, I think I'm kind of done. And I'll leave it on this, and we'll bring in a guy much smarter than I am, Zach. A lot of people will say, how is it possible that you have working class Latinos working with kind of the broligarchy, right? These tech billionaires. Why are they working in concert? Is it just that Latinos aren't smart enough to know what's good for them? And what I want you to do is understand the populist moment that we're in. The rejection of the political structure regardless of party. Because a lot of this populism is based on a lack of trust and confidence in the very institutions required to lead us into this next century. And for the moment, it has been working class Latinos and very, very wealthy billionaires who are revolting against the professional class. They're revolting against the credentialed class. They're revolting against those that lead organizations in government, in academia, in media, in all of those institutions that they feel have been captured by a political organization and a political agenda that does not meet their own existential view of the world. That's what's happening. That populist moment is pushing back and saying, these institutions do not work. But I don't want anybody to believe, and we can legitimately debate this and go over it, but I would ask you to please bring a lot of good data, because I've been looking at it very closely, that there is some sort of a pro-right-wing, pro-conservative shift that is happening in this country. There is very, very little data to show that. You might find one or two outlier data sets, but the overwhelming sense amongst Americans, Californians, and Latinos is that this whole institutional system does not work. And the main loser in that, in a state like California, is going to be the party in power. One of the most significant reasons that Kamala Harris did not do very well in her own home state. Favorite daughter of California has one of the worst performances in a presidential campaign since the late 1980s, since that 1992 race when Bill Clinton won it, by the way. Go back to 1992. Is because Latinos in huge, huge, huge numbers stayed home. They did not shift to Donald Trump, but they were not going to support a system and a political party that they believed, I think with a lot of evidence, was not working for them. California has more Latino representation than any state in the country, with the exception of New Mexico. And we have some of the worst social and economic metrics facing our community than anywhere else in the country. I would argue, I would submit to you that there is no state harder to live in, harder to provide for a family, for a Latino than California is by a very wide metric. And this is a state that we built. This is not coincidence. This is the state we wanted. This is the state we decided in that 1992, 1994 era that we wanted to be, and we've got it. And now what we're witnessing is the devolution of the political structure that built something that no longer works. And the test for our moment, the test at this time is going to be, can we fix it before the other party destroys it? So with that, let's come on up, Zach, and we'll chat about some of these ideas.
Thanks for that uplifting start to, it's like the most depressing conference ever. So let's bring it up.
Yeah.
So I've had the pleasure of doing, Mike and I have done a lot of panels, but we've also done a lot of national television stuff together. I noted that you didn't tell anybody you were a Republican. Was that like out of fear for your own safety in this room? But I think it's important for people to hear the truth, not just about what's going on in the state. And I always appreciate you always bring data to the discussion. But more important than that, I think that we need to transition into then some actions about what people can do. Because we're seeing a clear fundamental shift away from institutions. Unquestionably, I experienced it in the government, but I've seen it with my academic colleagues. I've seen it even in a trust of the healthcare industry, for example. How would you advise then, assuming that what you're saying is true, that we are at the precipice of a fundamental shift that has not been seen in this state's history, also eroding a fundamental faith in institutions, which, by the way, basically every single person in this room represents a traditional institution in one way or another. How do they then survive that transition? What advice would you give the group for that?
Well, thank you for that. And I am a Republican. I'm put a little caveat on this because I've learned to survive as a Republican in California for 30 years during this time. So I'm on the Endangered Species Act list, I think. I'm a Lincoln Project founder. So I'm a very different type of Republican, okay? Love me or hate me, that's who I am and I'm proud of it. The Democratic Party right now has occupied the space of becoming the defender of institutions, as the Republican Party has devolved into an anti-institutionalist populist party. The idea that we were having discussions about right and left are a faded, antiquated notion. Donald Trump has never extolled the virtues of smaller government because he doesn't believe in it. He supports bigger government as long as it matches or can enforce his worldview or can harm and punish his enemies. He's all about all of those. The Democratic Party, though, look at the banner of the Democratic Party this last election cycle, ran from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to Liz Cheney. It's trying to protect what it broadly defines as democracy. What it's really saying is we need to protect all of our institutions. The problem is a lot of our institutions do not work, and the Democratic Party is not capable of having a truly honest conversation about that. What do I mean by that? High-speed rail doesn't work. A third of our community college enrollment are ghost students taking, there was a chancellor of a community college here earlier, maybe he's left by now, okay? The community college system is being manipulated, not just a handful of students, some estimates are a third of the enrollees in our community college students are ghosts, they are not real. The Economic Development Department is missing billions and billions and billions of dollars. Huge numbers, not billions, but many millions of dollars have been lost through nonprofits that we use to house homeless people. These institutions aren't working. And until we're honest about that, we can't ever rebuild the credibility and the trust of the public that we desperately need to help side with us to protect and further the aims of what we're trying to accomplish. It's very easy in this populist moment to attack institutions because they're singularly difficult to defend. Now, a big part of this problem is this is very indicative and characteristic of the digital age. Our information flows are moving sideways at a time when our institutions are hierarchical. Everybody is an expert. Your own science is your own science. Your own data is your own data. You can choose your own life, reality, and adventure and argue, not correctly, but commonly, that your belief system, your own research is as valid as anybody else's. That's the main corrosive effect of this attack on institutions. That's my wind up to get to the answer, which is, I don't exactly know. But what I do know is this. What we have to have is the understanding of what the core mission is of the institutions that you all built. And one of the challenges of a transformation like this is that core mission is central, even though the tactics of what is employed to get there may not be the same thing. I gave a keynote speech to CSAC, the California State Association of Counties, a few months ago, and pressed every one of those folks there, the board of supervisors and the CEOs of various counties, with one quick question. If you had a room full of people under 30 years old and technological experts, people who were succeeding and thriving in the private sector in this digital space, and you ask them to create a contraption to deliver the services that you do as a county, how many of them would come up with the system that you're working in, or even close to it? That's not an argument for privatization. It's an argument to understand that the institutions that we built in the industrial age aren't going to work in the digital age. So I will tell you what some of the common characteristics I believe they will be. They will be far, far more flat. They will be far less hierarchical. They will require much more community input in a way that we have never seen before, because people always say they want community input and then they never show up to get the input and involvement that they commit to and that you demand and that you change an organization to do so, and then they'll complain about it even though you've created a million ways to get their input. I get it. I see it. But unless we adapt our institutions away from hierarchy and towards a more horizontal structure, we will probably not see a successful outcome in this transformation to this next era, this next age.
These changes are going to occur a lot more slowly in an institutional structure than they are in society. True? I mean, think
yes.
about. I mean, about like you think about the UC system. You think about the county or city government structures. Those systems are going to change more reactively than proactively.
Yes.
To this.
Yes.
So, give me a time frame understanding. By the way, we don't prep for any of this mainly because we're exceptionally lazy. So he has no idea what I'm going to ask. I mean, serious, at all. And so I apologize if I'm asking.
No.
Yeah. We give a time frame understanding then for the institutional bodies out here of how long the transition is going to be, so they have an understanding of when. Is this something they should be operating on now? Are they on a 5-year lagging indicator?
Yeah.
What are you thinking?
Let me also add this one caveat too. And I know this is going to sound very strange. I have never been more optimistic about where we're going than I am at this moment. Because this had to happen. This is inevitable. And the same fear and panic and anxiety that you felt when Fort Ord was closing down, what could the future possibly look like? This is the time to reimagine it. And you did remarkably well. Nobody would have predicted 30 years ago that it would have turned out anywhere near as well as it did. But you did it. This is that same moment, okay? As people who have the responsibility and the burden of carrying institutions on your shoulders, literally, you guys are literally the drivers of this region. I understand the anxiety, but I would beg you to also see the opportunity, because the upside is far bigger than the downside, far bigger, okay? So that's one. The reason why I kind of laughed and paused when he began the question is because the last two institutions that this rattling is going to impact are going to be government and the academy. If you told the music industry, hey, this thing called the internet is coming and it's going to change your industry, they're like, yeah, welcome to the year 2002. Look at the newspaper industry, look at the media. This has happened everywhere except for the two institutions designed to protect itself from the sways of public opinion and to be more stable through bureaucracies. That is the academy and government. So I would say this, for the academy and government now, it's not coming, it's here. It's not going to happen in one day. It's going to happen as you reimagine it, given the constraints and the attacks that you're under. And those attacks are very real, but like I also advise some deans in the UC system, this is an extraordinary opportunity to do all the things that you could never do without this threat. And the academy, sorry to all of those here in higher ed, I think is uniquely challenged as an institution because it has things that nobody else has. The insular protection, the tenure system. I mean, let's be honest. What is that anymore? Okay, I understand the rationale for it. I understand the reason for it. I get, academic free. I get all of that. But come on, come on. Nobody gets that anymore, and I'm not sure anybody should get that anymore. There are ways to develop and inculcate things like academic freedom around those things. I would argue that some of the insularity of the academy allowed it to become as outside of the mainstream as it has become. And it is very outside of the mainstream, and it's why it's lost support from the public. It's why you can allow a bunch of crazy Republicans to look like the normal people in the debate. That's how far out of the mainstream it's gotten. So there are some very particular problems with the academy. Government has been dealing with this whipsaw since at least the Goldwater era. Right? This is not new, and it's not ever going to change meaningfully, but I do believe that it will adapt and find ways to resolve itself because at some point, especially at the local level, there is a need to have an active functioning provider of the most basic services. I would submit one caveat. I think a large scope of what you're doing is not going to look anything like you do now or delivered the way you do now in 10, 15, or 20 years. And if it does, you're doing it wrong.
All right, we've got 15 minutes left, and that sounded really intellectual. So I'm going to bring it down to a political level because I'm a former elected official. Are you comfortable with that?
I'm ready. Let's go.
All right. Who is going to win the midterms?
Well,
Look, you and I, we go through the data and
Yeah.
all this. I mean, you were totally 150% wrong in your presidential
I was.
predictions. So
Yeah.
why don't we just
Yeah.
give them false information now? And be political pundits, which we've been paid to do.
Yeah.
Right? So
Yes.
so who's going to win the midterms?
The Democrats will win the midterms. I think potentially at a very historical level. I think you could see maybe a 40-seat pickup, which is not as much as Obama lost. You were there when you were advising the president.
That was nice. Thanks
That was a
for
historical.
That was a nice touch. That was that way to slip.
Yeah.
Way to slip that in there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's limited a little bit because of the gerrymandering has gotten so tight and we've become so polarized that there's really only so many seats that can go away. But my big fear is that the Democrats will win without losing the lessons of the 2024 election, because it will be a Pyrrhic victory, and that puts them in a very weak, damaged position heading into the next presidential election, if there's going to be an election. I'm kidding. I was kidding. There will be a presidential election. Especially,
Too soon, Mike.
especially if the Democrats win the midterms. I do believe that they will. But I do want to say I was wrong in my prediction in the last presidential election. But I want to explain why. The reason why I was wrong was primarily because there was not anywhere near the movement of women towards the Democratic Party that we saw in the 2026 midterms. And the idea that women would be motivated by the reproductive rights issue became a sacrosanct belief system with every Democratic operative, and the models that they were putting out were showing that this was happening, and it's why they doubled down on things like saving democracy. Saving democracy works in rooms like this because what we're really saying is protecting institutions. You go out to the construction site or the manufacturing line, you talk about saving democracy, they not only don't know what the hell you're talking about, you just sound like a bunch of political people. They're far, far more concerned about paying rent on Friday. And you may dismiss this, you may ridicule them, but they know the price of eggs. They know the price of gas. And to me, those are the people of virtue in this country, not that the people in this room are not, but you cannot have a working democracy without the support of your middle class. You cannot do it, okay? And, thank you, and when you're paying 50% of your income on a mortgage or for rent, you know what the price of eggs are. You know what the price of gas is. You know what the price of a bell pepper is. You know what the price of everything is. I grew up in a home like that. So those are the people that are making democracy work or not work. And when they're saying it's not working for me, we're doing our institutions wrong.
I agree. I wasn't successful of having anybody listen to me last time. Okay, well then, so the Dems are going to win. They're going to have a 40-seat. They probably won't. Maybe not the Senate though. I mean, it'll be close, but
It won't have the
Senate.
But
So
it'll close
they'll
up.
take over the House.
Yeah.
Okay, so it'll be nonstop hearings and investigations that'll go nowhere,
Yes.
and no one will.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
So we've got 2 years to look forward to, 2 more years of inaction.
Yeah.
So then, who will win the next California governor's race?
Well, with all the cheering and excitement about the candidates in the room, let me just wait till that goes down a little bit. If Kamala Harris gets in, I think I think it's hard to say that she doesn't win. I don't know that there's a lot of energy and excitement for her candidacy because I don't think that it's a forward step for the Democratic Party. And I'm not trying to take anything away from Kamala Harris. I don't think she would be a very good governor despite that. I say that because I've known and worked with and around her and against her and sometimes with her and for her on various issues for her entire career. California we should be having a battle in California with the top 6 or 7 Democrats ready to run for president in a state as blue as we are. The fact that this state is not as successful as a blue panacea should be is all the reason you need to understand why we don't. And that's something I think we all need to breathe in. Ezra Klein, this is not Mike Madrid, right-wing Republican saying. Ezra Klein just wrote a book called Abundance on it. It doesn't work. It's all the problems that you are dealing with day in and day out. And understanding the structure that we've built as to why it doesn't work and for who it doesn't work most importantly is key to understanding what the next institutions need to look like. So If Kamala Harris jumps in, I think she will. I think she's by far and away the odds-on favorite, almost as a default. I don't believe that the Republicans will be competitive. I think the gap between Republicans and Democrats will continue to narrow for some time, but I believe that the Democratic Party is going to go through an internal battle about whether or not it is a party that it has been for these past 30 years, or whether it's going to get back to its working class roots and start advocating in a policy framework for people who work with their hands for a living and don't have college degrees and are renters that want to be homeowners.
We've had that discussion in this, it's playing out in this region acutely, right? Highest cost of living based on income in the United States, depending upon the survey. Some of the least amount of housing construction. Until recently, there's been some changes, but we're 30 to 40 years behind the eight ball on this. Loss of significant major industries that were traditionally higher paying here, commuting workforce, second home owners, vacation rentals, service industry. The gap is significant. What was interesting from a local policy perspective, Mike, is that I'd find that some of the biggest opponents to the things that what I thought would be a progressive value were the progressives. And, whatever it may be. I mean, if we're having an honest conversation about it, it was like if you wanted to, like we debate about widening the highway, which would most greatly reduce commute times for the poorest members in our community to get to a service job. The people that were at all the meetings were, white progressives saying that it can't do it. The same thing with housing, on and on and on. But what hasn't changed is the political makeup. So I'm going to challenge you on something on this. Is that I think that what you're talking about, and I could be wrong. I mean, I'm not looking at the data in this level, micro level. You are. I think that these shifts are occurring at a state and federal level. I'm not seeing them the same way at the local level, which was sort of interesting because it should be playing out that way, where you would be seeing the same political shift for a county board of supervisors, city councils, et cetera. I don't really think you are. Why do you think, or even school boards? So why do you think that
Yeah, that's a great question.
disconnect is happening?
So there's two things I want to say kind of in response to that. And I had the distinct honor, I guess it's an honor, the pro tem of the Senate here in California, Mike McGuire, called and asked me to present at the retreat right after the election for the Senate Democrats. The first time they'd ever asked a Republican. So I said, Mike, are you sure you want that? Because you know me, I'm going to tell you what I think. And he said, no, that's why we want you there. And so one of the questions I asked them, and remember, it's a very large caucus from a Senate perspective. I think there's only 7 Republicans, so it's 33 senators. And I said, we just had these horrific fires in LA. By a show of hands, how many of you would be willing to waive CEQA if just Altadena burned down and not the Palisades? Let's be honest about this. Rich white people on the coast, we'll do everything possible to fix that by tomorrow. So we can do it. Working class black and brown people in Altadena? Well, wait a second. It's called the California Environmental Quality Act. There are certain things that we need to... Housing has been a black and brown crisis for 20 years in this state. Okay? It's been a crisis for 20 years. It's been an emergency for 20 years. So we have the political capacity to fix these problems. We lack the political will to do it. We don't want to do it. And getting to the why we don't want to do it is an awkward, tough conversation, to your point. That coalition, the coalition of kind of wealthier white progressives and younger, poorer Latinos, working class Latinos, the glue that held that coalition together for 3 decades in California, do you know what that was? Because there's not a whole lot in common culturally. There's not a whole lot in common socially. There's not a whole lot in common economically. So why were they voting in lockstep together? What was the commonality that they had? Any guesses? They hated Republicans. That's what it was. That's gone now, guys. It's gone. Latinos aren't afraid to vote for Republicans. They'll vote for Donald Trump. That's how bad it is. They'll do it. They did it. Okay? So that coalition has come apart. And that's why I'm saying the opportunity for people like the people in this room means that the coalitions are going to be different. They are going to change. They have already changed. And they're going to, the way you appeal to the constituencies when you're advocating for health, when you're advocating for home building, affordable housing, market rate housing, when you're advocating for economic development or the investment on businesses has changed. The way you have looked at your own issues, every one of you in this room, the way you lobbied 2, 3, 4 years ago is not the same lobbying coalition support letter group that you should be bringing to advocate for your agenda. Again, if you're still doing that same thing, you're doing it entirely wrong. I don't know if that answered the second part of the question.
It usually doesn't, but it sounded really good.
Yeah.
So briefly, because you can see we don't have a whole lot of time left, then why aren't you seeing then significant shifts at the local electoral level?
There it is. That is the second part of the question. Let me say this, and I said earlier, this shift rightward, as it has been explained, a lot of people are saying this Latino rightward shift. I've been trying to point out that it is not. You will see in places like Los Angeles or deep, deep blue areas, no Republican necessarily running, but you will see a Democratic Socialist running, and they will get support. The two most popular politicians for Latinos in America right now are not just Donald Trump, but Bernie Sanders. Often in the same community, the same persons will support these because they're populists. They're anti-establishment. When Bernie Sanders says the system is rigged, he's not just talking about capitalism, he's talking about the Democratic Party, and he's talking about every other part of life. And if you're a Latino going, you know what, the system is rigged. It is rigged. And when Donald Trump says, this is just a swamp, and all these people are, standing here, stepping on your throat, and I alone can fix it, they're going, yeah, why not? I know what's going to happen if I keep voting the same way I've been voting. So you are seeing a movement, again, away from the Democratic Party. If you understand the Democratic Party to be an institutional party, don't look at it as, we're pro-choice and we're pro-democracy and we're pro. Don't even look at it as a list of what you stand for. Look at yourselves, if you're a Democrat, I'm guessing a lot of people in here are, as the defenders of institutions. That's what they're voting against. They're voting against the professional class because the institutions are not, real or perceived, serving the needs of the community. And so that's not uncommon. We looked at in Los Angeles County, for example, there was just as much of a movement to the Democratic Socialists as there were to Donald Trump in terms of county. In fact, some of the districts where there was the most rightward shift for president, they were electing Democratic Socialists down ticket. That's really strong evidence to show that that's the case.
So we want to get 2 questions in from the audience.
Yeah.
But I'm going to ask you one last question, and I just want 2 names. Then if the Democratic standard bearer you think is going to run is not the best, name 2 people you want to run for governor then.
Here in California?
Yeah, here in California.
Well, a caveat is I'm working for one, so I'm going to put his name out there. I'm working for Stephen Klubeck. And what's going, who the hell is Stephen Klubeck? That's why I'm working for him. And I'm going to tell you why. Every other name that you're going to hear are only names that you will hear in rooms like this that know who they are. Betty Yee, Elena Scopoulos, Javier Becerra, Antonio Villaraigosa, God bless them all. I know them all. We're all good friends. Katie Porter, they're all friends, right? They're all the same shade of the same ice cream. There's not a single one of them that is going to be able to credibly stand before the people of California and say, I succeeded at doing this by passing AB this or SB that. Okay? It's just, they will get elected by default. That's why earlier I said I'm just so uninspired as are Californians by what we have to offer. If you believe that your track record of success from any one of these people has meaningfully redefined or prepared California for this new age we're entering, I'm sorry, you're wrong. You have to literally be from outside the system, not in the outsider 1990s perspective, Ross Perot perspective, but having an actual track record of fixing organizations and systems. So that's where I would be putting my emphasis. That's where I put my belief system. I think Katie Porter is stronger than most people think. I don't think Katie Porter will last more than 1 second when Kamala Harris gets into the race. She's essentially said so.
2 questions from the audience. Let's start with Matt because we've been bashing the community college system and I want him to feel good about himself. Are you one of the 1/3 of the people that really aren't registered, Matt? Just go ahead and admit it.
Before you get to Matt, let me say this. I was bashing the higher ed system. The community college system is actually the perfect way to look at the way higher ed should be done. And I say this as somebody who community colleges saved my life. I was on the board of governor of the community college system when I was a student representative. There was no bigger advocate in this room or in the state of community college systems than I do. But it's because, and my kids were UC grads. But the reason is the crown jewel of the higher education system in California is not UC, it is not CSU, it is the community college system because it was built for exactly a moment in time that is not terribly different than now, and that's where we should be focusing our energy and efforts and resources.
Good. Thank you, Mike. And it's a good save from what I was going to ask you about. Okay? I just want to correct what you said earlier about students and community college enrollment. And then I'm going to pivot to the question part of it. So I want to correct you to say that 30% of the applicants to community colleges are ghosts, because we spend an inordinate amount of time in our financial aid office getting rid of those students who are trying to abuse federal financial aid and conduct fraud. And so I can tell you just from our own experience, what used to be a couple of years ago, 15 students who we would dismiss from rosters before the semester starts was probably around 1,000 at the spring of 2025.
Yeah.
So the colleges are doing incredible work having to root out fraudulent students who are trying to get financial aid in that way, which gets me to my question about how is that happening? The platform by which they apply for financial aid, for applying to the college, is the internet. So a very invention of higher education and the Department of Defense is now a platform for criminal enterprise. At the same time, it's a platform for tremendous economic prosperity and transactions across an entire economy. So the question to put back to you is, how do we harness the energy of, let's say, the people in the room you wanted to get, the 30 and youngers, to use that platform for good and attacking back on the criminal enterprise that's using that platform for bad?
Well, look, you're talking about a very specific circumstance, and my immediate reaction was kind of first like, the internet's been around a long time. The fact that this is now becoming a problem tells me it's not the internet. It's the systems that the state uses. That's the problem. Otherwise, you would have this problem in 1994 when I was on the board of governors for the community college system. It's not the internet. The internet is just a tool. And that's my bigger point, is our systems don't work. And until they do, the fact that, you're right, I messed up on enrollment, but the point is still made. I mean, it's still, you got 1,000 ghost students. This is millions and millions of dollars in that waste, fraud, and abuse, right? And you're catching most of them, I get it, I understand all of that. But you're spending the staff time to have to go out and do it. Private sectors, no company would survive doing it that way. With, I guess the credit card companies do that, right? They're just kind of roll over the debt, which is its own problem. But kind of to my point, like the private sector figured this out 25, 30 years ago.
Well, to amplify your point,
Yeah.
if I turn it over to the Justice Department,
Yeah.
is that system going to help me at this point prosecute this?
I don't know, but I don't think you should be in the business of worrying about prosecution, although it's obviously a valid point. I think the bigger point is you should be focused more on the systems that aren't screwed up in the first place. That's the right order of things. Like, why can't California get that right? The number of billions of dollars taken from the Economic Development Department for unemployment scams, it's in the billions, guys. We don't even know where it's at. There's like $19 billion unaccounted for. I don't even know what that, I can't even fathom what that looks like. Nobody literally knows where it's at. We can't even fix the problem because the problem is so bad, it's so endemic in the system that everyone's just like, oh yeah, we lost $19 billion. What I do know is $19 billion would build a lot of houses. Not as many in California as it should, but it would build some. It would feed a lot of kids who have empty bellies. It could do a lot of good, but we're just kind of go, it's not that big of a deal. High-speed rail. I'm sure that everyone in here is a supporter of high-speed rail. I'm not saying that I'm not, but I'm not. I wouldn't vote for high-speed rail at $135 billion when they sold it to me as a $13 billion proposal. And who thinks it's really going to get done for $130 billion, by the way? Ain't no way. Ain't no way. It's going to be way more expensive than that. And again, this isn't just that old Republican crotchety taxpayer stuff. This is Ezra Klein wrote a book, a chapter about this. This is the Democrats finally having their own reckoning, going, you know what? For all of our values, none of this stuff is working. And who's getting hurt the most? It's working class people who in this state are black and brown people. It's become the inequality that we're driving is becoming a racial problem. Some will say it always has been. I would argue if it is, then all the more shame on you for building systems like this that quantifiably do not work.
Last question.
Last question.
Mike, thank you so much for offering your perspective. I recently had a conversation with a few, college friends who supported Trump, Latino, one of whom got laid off through these, cuts that Doge has been making. The other one whose mother got picked up by ICE. And what was so interesting in that conversation was that their attitude around the Trump administration and the Republican Party as a whole immediately shifted as they felt the personal impact to their lives. Mm-hmm. And we're hearing story after story in the Latino community that this anti-Latino rhetoric that is pronounced in social media every day, in media every day, is beginning to have a shift of heart because of either personal impact or because of the blatant racism against Latinos. So given that, what is your perspective of how that's going to shift the Latinos in California?
Yeah, I wrote a very long essay on this just last night because a whole round of polling has come out, and what you're seeing anecdotally is manifesting itself in the data, which shouldn't be terribly surprising. But here's the caution. And like I said, I think this year, these midterms are going to size up very much like the 2018 midterms. Latinos supported Donald Trump in higher measures than they did Mitt Romney in 2012. Okay, in 2016. People don't realize that. The rightward shift began in 2016. But in 2018, we had the highest Latino turnout in midterm in the entire history of this country, and it was the most anti-Republican, anti-Trump in the history of the country. Okay? All in response to the exact same dynamics that are happening now. The problem is partisans choose and pick their data selectively. The message that I was trying to convey in my book was not a prediction, although, as Zach pointed out, most of this stuff came true. It's data-based. It was a warning. My book is a warning to the Democratic Party. If you can't pick your eyes up off the horizon and see what you're doing, you will lose to Donald Trump again with a record share of Latino voters. That's exactly what happened. And I'm bringing this up for a reason. Because these voters are going to go back to their traditional voting patterns and vote against the Republican Party does not mean that they support your agenda. Does not mean that you have succeeded. Does not mean that what you're doing is working. None of that is true. That's why they left you in the first place. And until a party or a person or the community rises up and demands an economic agenda for an aspirational working class, we are going to be caught between this voter group, which is not necessarily swinging towards one or the other, but rejecting one or the other. Your failures as a party don't necessarily mean, or the failures of the other party don't mean that you're a success. That's the lesson that the Democratic Party did not learn the entire Trump era, and it's still not figuring it out. So as I've said, our Great Depression that's coming may save our democracy because enough people are going to vote for their economic interests and throw the Republicans out. That's not an affirmation for the Democratic Party's record or success or policy proposals at all. And that's my great fear for the midterms.
Let's thank Mike.